Some giggles, that's good. Okay, people are awake, that's great. I'm Heather Thacker. Nice to meet all of you. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, but I live here currently. Today we're going to go through an analogy of baking and DevOps. Can everyone hear me okay? For those who are listening, perfect. So I'm currently a developer advocate for Chef. I've been doing this for about 9 months. Before that, I was at startups. I've worked in enterprises and startups as a full-time, as a full-stack software engineer. And before that, I was a baker. I was a professional baker. I baked breads and pastries. I've won awards for my biscuits. I've been in magazines. I've worked in fine dining. I've worked at farmers markets. And so this talk was kind of something that I never really intended to do. I never really thought I would be talking about baking at a tech conference. But the first day I was working at Chef it was a Chef Conf, and they had this evening event with Ignite Talks where, if you're familiar, maybe not, it's a 5-minute talk where the slide auto increments every 15 seconds, and you have 20 slides. And so I thought, why not talk about baking and DevOps? So that's kind of how this talk started, and so I'm really excited to talk about baking and DevOps. It's kind of an overview, more of a beginner-friendly sort of look at DevOps. It's more of a way to think about DevOps. I don't know if you're going to learn anything crazy specific to your own infrastructure setup, but maybe it will give you a curious way of thinking about things. Yeah, okay, well, if you want to, this is all I'm going to say about Chef, which is where I work now. Maybe you've recognized the old logo, which is the tiny one in the top. It was acquired 4 years ago by Progress, which is a software company. Chef is open source DevOps tool for automation and configuration management. It uses cookbooks to facilitate infrastructure and configuration as code, and it easily integrates with a lot of different platforms. It's used by Meta, IBM, Capital One, Carfax, Target, Panera. How many of you have heard of Chef or used Chef in the past? 4. Awesome. So I like to know where talks are going, so I figured I would give you a menu del dia, a menu of the day. First, we're going to kind of look at culture and automation, and then we'll see the differences of out-of-the-box versus mixing from scratch DevOps infrastructure. And then we'll kind of go into an analogy. We'll look at disaster recovery and planning, and then a few recipes for success. And if there's enough time, we'll look at a few state of DevOps reports. Any questions before I get started? Comments? Were you breathing? I used to be a yoga teacher, so I'm always like heavily concerned about people and how well they're breathing. But I'm not going to make you breathe with me today, but I do hope that you're doing that. So before we get into it, there is a lot going on with DevOps, and it's funny because it's supposed to be this thing that breaks down the silos between development and operations, but it can kind of be overwhelming, especially looking at the landscape. So the term was coined around 2007, 2008, and it was kind of a response to like waterfall management for software, and it aligns more with like agile methodologies, because in the 80s, like it was always just kind of a one-person show, writing the code, building, deploying, maintaining, testing, security. It could all be done by one person. But as complexity grew and roles evolved and changed, so did the tooling and teams. So there's a ton of different tools that you can use for going through your DevOps lifecycle. So before we get too deep into the analogy or some of the other stuff, I wanted to emphasize 2 very important aspects, philosophy of culture and automation. So baking is largely dependent on the mother, which is a culture, a colony of yeast and bacteria working together to digest grains and turn it into these tasty profiles that we have that gives us flavor. And for DevOps, I know that we talk a lot about tooling, but it is heavily dependent on culture. It's a philosophy of collaboration and community, and so DevOps doesn't really work if you're not working together and communicating with your teammates. And secondly, automation. We mix by hand to learn the craft, both with baking and probably DevOps too. And then as we scale, it's just not reasonable to do everything by hand. So we automate, we use machines. We're not rolling out dough by hand every day unless you're trying to ruin your hands. You use machines to laminate your doughs, to mix your cookie batters. So keep these aspects in mind. We'll continue to touch on them throughout the talk. And I spent a lot of time making this little graphic. I don't know if we have box mixes here in Spain. Can you buy these here? This is, I feel like, a very American shelf. Maybe you recognize Betty Crocker and all the different boxes if you've been to America. I think we have these here. I'm not sure. I personally don't use them because I'm such a skilled baker, but I picked some of my favorite DevOps tools. How many of you have used one of those tools before? Okay, great. I would hope so, because I tried to pick some of the more common pieces. I'm glad you guys are still all responding to me, because sometimes it's really awkward when no one, like, they're just like staring or half listening, and then no one raises their hands. So great. So most companies, they have some tooling. It's rare that you find a company that is doing everything by like in-house by scratch. I think maybe Netflix does a lot of it themselves, but I'm sure that they also use external tooling. So often you need something to help along the way if you're going to scale. Even for bakers who mix by hand, even though I pride myself in doing everything by scratch, it's just really not reasonable. Although I would love to, it's just not reasonable to milk my cows, turn it into butter, grow grain fields, and mill that into wheat, own chickens, and create eggs. So we really have to depend on the community to provide these elements working together to create our product. Are you noticing something about the icons up here? Yeah, is there? Okay. So I know my slides are a little word dense, they're a little wordy, and I apologize for that, but here is just an overview of looking at some of the factors of out-of-the-box tooling versus made from scratch. And I think there's a lot of things to consider when looking at it. There's limitations too, like out of the box it's really great if you're short on time, but it can create like vendor lock-in. There's a lot of cost considerations to consider, integration challenges. It can lack customization and flexibility. And then from scratch limitations, although it's really, you learn a lot by building things from scratch. You really do, but then it requires a lot of development and time resources, a lot of maintenance and upkeep. There's a lot of initial costs, and innovation and keeping up with technology trends is kind of difficult sometimes. So we're gonna kind of look at this analogy between DevOps and baking. I kind of simplified it into 4 different parts, with DevOps divided into planning, building, deploying, and monitoring, and then baking divided as like prepping, mixing, baking, and feedback. So the first part, planning and prepping. In tech, we ask a lot of questions, I would hope, and the answer to most of those questions is that it depends. What are you building? What resources do you have? What does it look like? Who's it for? And it's important to have all these questions answered in excruciating detail before we get going, just to set ourselves up for success. Do we have enough resources? Are we wasting resources? Are we building fast enough before the butter melts? These are really important questions, because timing is everything, and as bakers, we are hyper aware of the passing of time. A few seconds can make a really big difference. Everything has to align, like the seasonality of apples, the pie dough has to be chilled yet relaxed. You need a golden image of a perfectly baked pie in order to replicate it a million times a day. So in order to be very efficient, it's really necessary to be planning and prepping everything along the way. But as we know, we go through the cycles and we iterate and we find things to improve upon. The next stage, building and mixing. By the time we're here, hopefully we know all the different pieces of the pie that we're gonna put together, and we have envisioned this final product that is perfect and ready to build, to mix. But you know, things can go wrong, and sometimes we find that the machines and the ingredients are not behaving exactly how we want to, so that really puts a lot of importance on testing. Taste testing your product along the way, and also testing your application and build as you go through the motions. And then, assuming that you have everything mixed and built, ready to go, it's time for the deployment and baking stage. This one, it's really important to have trustworthy tools. You really need to know your oven and the temperature control, the hot spots, the timers working as you would expect. All the resources are allocated and the tests are complete. We have to really have a lot of faith in our tooling. The environments have to be ready, configured. Tests are green, no red errors, no flames from your burnt bread, even though those make for good stories. It's not ideal. So yeah, we have to trust those tools so that we're not opening the oven door halfway through the process and letting out that heat and ruining your perfectly elevated loaf of bread. Monitoring and feedback. This kind of closes out the cycle of DevOps and baking as a loop. We have to have accurate monitors, logs, snapshots into what's happening in case we need to intervene and stop a bigger disaster from happening. We need to have spend time with our final product and understand how people engage with what we've created, reflect upon the insights and the first impressions, the interpretations of what you're making, interactions, all this in order to continuously influence the future iterations. And I thought this was a really cool graphic of DevOps tooling. How many of you have seen this before? Okay, awesome. I'm glad it's like a thing that we all know about. But as like a science nerd, a STEM child, I was obsessed with the periodic table, so this is a really cool graphic to kind of like see what is out there. And with baking and DevOps, it's both a science and an art. You have to abide by the rules of chemistry, but also you kind of need that innovation and creativity to create new flavor profiles. So another way of looking at DevOps and baking together is kind of like a cake. Like as a whole, it's one thing, but when you start looking at the tiers, each base has an important element. So the base is for DevOps, it's collaboration and communication, the shared responsibility across all the roles, the support that is provided to all the other layers. This is kind of like the methodologies, agile, CI/CD. And then the second layer, it adds structure and height. It's a framework for rapid and reliable delivery, automation, tooling, deployment pipelines, config management, infrastructure as code. And then the next layer, it's maybe leveraging cloud and hybrid services for flexibility, containerization to build scalable and flexible applications, use the cloud for on-demand resources, and they help to deploy consistently across environments. And then the fourth is a protective layer where security is integrated across every phase of DevOps ideally. Automating security testing, vulnerability scanning, compliance checks, so that can sometimes come later in the process. And then the top tier here is monitoring, logging, visibility into the application performance, operational metrics, feedback loops, and this allows you to quickly identify issues, respond to incidents, optimize workflows. And then the decoration, that is, I guess, what makes your team special. The daily cadences, the interactions, the je ne sais quoi of your team and company, elements that really foster transparency and trust, a shared understanding and alignment. So you can see like the layered complexity and interdependency. Each one builds upon another to form a whole, which is a robust and secure system made of cake. Before we move on, is there any questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, hopes, wishes, dreams? Okay. Is everyone still breathing? Okay, me too. Disaster recovery. So, disaster recovery planning. Who has had like a huge outage? One person? I feel like there's probably more. Security. So what can cause disasters? Natural disasters, of course, flooding, fires, tornadoes, tsunamis, any will of God or the universe, cosmos, outages, security risks. And we see these days that there's a lot of really bad actors at play, a lot of hackers and malicious intent coming into our systems, especially now with the rise of AI and automation. So I feel like sometimes it's hard to keep up with all the bad actors out there. So it's important to, have your disaster recovery plan in place. And there's kind of, five steps here that I've outlined, but of course it's a lot more than this. It's really having a plan in place to analyze like what systems are most at risk, which systems need backups and snapshots. Maybe you have servers that need backup regions, or you're streaming data constantly if it's really sensitive. These are all different approaches, and I think it really depends on what you're working with and how much you can afford to be down during an outage, or how much time it takes to recovery, if you can afford that, and who your users are, if they're going to be really upset if Amazon goes down for half a second. I feel like a lot of people would be upset, but if you're just running a website for your portfolio, maybe it's fine if it's down for a month and you're not looking for a job. So understanding what the company needs and what kind of risk you can take on is super important when creating this recovery plan. And then with disaster recovery handling, I think that as developers and people in tech, we all kind of brace ourselves for the inevitable failures and outages. As a baker, I've definitely burned bread. I've tried to bake chocolate cakes that ended up turning into brownies, or repurposing cookies into, truffles. So having this way of taking a disaster and turning it into another opportunity to learn and grow, is very valuable and a healthy aspect of culture. So when a disaster happens, really identifying and notifying and creating that assessment is important. And, as you go through your plan, which is well documented and tested, ideally you're testing every year, if not every quarter, then I think it's the most important part is doing, a blameless postmortem, knowing what you can learn from your incidents and taking that to see how you can create a more robust system, because at the end of the day, feeling blamed for a mistake is not great, and that is a reflection of the system failing you and not your own error. So here are some recipes for success. I just picked some things, and it looks like I need to adjust the font right there, but to reiterate, the concept of having a really healthy culture and system is, I think, the foundation, and then being able to empower developers and encourage experimentation and have that space to do so through automation, and having all the tedious tasks, the repetition, handled by your scripts, your machines, your tooling. It's really can create like longevity within your product. Okay, so I'm like zipping through this. That's great. Okay, so for the, I wanted to include two really nice pieces of literature here. This is some summary of the 2024 State of DevOps report that was published by Puppet, Humanitech, CD Foundation, and Women in DevOps. Who here has like seen the DORA report and pays attention? Okay, 5 people, that's awesome. So, so in this report by Puppets, they pointed out the drivers of success are efficiency, speed, and security. And their goal with this report, when surveying 40,000 people, is to better understand the people, processes, and trends that shape DevOps every year. They conducted this survey, and thought leaders analyzed the data, incorporated trends, and these are some of the key findings. For Puppet, they really focused on the evolution of platform engineering, and this is another talk that I'm giving later in the year about DevOps versus platform engineering. Spoiler alert, platform engineering fits in nicely with DevOps. It's kind of like 2 parts of a whole. So having elements of platform engineering within your DevOps philosophy can really speed up and create tighter feedback loops. Platform engineering can act as a barrier against the chaos of tools, tasks, and information by creating these little packets of reusable infrastructure environments, provisioning, security pieces that the developers can take and run with, so that they're not creating more silos and bottlenecks, which was the goal of DevOps, but we find that with complexity increasing, we need more solutions to the problems that DevOps is also creating. So platform engineering kind of creates that solution to the additional silos that are built by having DevOps. Yeah. So the rise of developers is supported by platform engineering team with the self-servicing tools. They give developers flexibility to work, and then the full potential of DevOps is unlocked with automation. It streamlines key processes, eliminates repetition, accelerates delivery, and it happens simultaneously with the expanding platform functions. And security is it's built into platform engineering, and everyone benefits when it is. It empowers people to take responsibility from the very beginning to ensure compliance. Okay. And this was another report that I looked at, the State of DevOps report for 2023. This one surveyed over 36,000 people, and it was presented by Dora and Google Cloud. It explored the outcomes of organizational performance, team performance, and employee well-being. It looked at software delivery performance and operational performance, and its key findings were interesting. First one, establishing a healthy culture. They found that teams with generative cultures have 30% higher organizational performance. Built with users in mind, the teams that focused on users have 40% higher organizational performance. And unlocking software development delivery performance with faster code reviews. This was actually something that I experienced when I was a developer maybe 5 years ago, the really quick cycle of code reviews, and I think that was when I first became very interested in DevOps without realizing what DevOps was. To have the ability within my small team, it was a huge enterprise company, but to be able to just like ping my teammate and jump on a call to review my code and get it merged and into production like 1 hour later was amazing. To have these like bite-sized little code changes. I don't know about you, but like when I see a PR with like 5,000 lines of code changes, like, does that make me want to do it and look at it and review it? Kind of no. I don't know. I feel like that's the smaller and bite-sized you can take these tasks down, the changes, the more efficient your code reviews become, and the less of a a waterfall mentality you have about pushing to production. So you're unlocking software delivery performance with faster code reviews. Okay, amplifying the capabilities with quality documentation. They found that trunk-based development, where like everyone is working on code in a single branch, is estimated to have like 13 times more impact on performance when the quality of documentation is higher than versus lower, which I think maybe is intuitive, but I think also, as much as I want documentation to be a first-class citizen in software development, it's often an afterthought. And I wish it was easier to change that. I'm still trying to think of ways to like make that change. I'm sure there's organizations out there who prioritize documentation. I was looking at Material UI's documentation, and they have like a really clean and up-to-date and useful set of docs. I know Chef, we're still rewriting our documentation, so I'm like actively always thinking of ways to help even our company to like write better documentation. Okay, let's see here. What else? Yeah. Increasing infrastructure flexibility with cloud. Using a public cloud leads to 22% increase in infrastructure flexibility, which leads to 30% higher organizational performance versus the inflexible. Balancing delivery speed and user focus. I think that's a hard challenge. Balancing is something that we practice, and we practice it because we need to be better at it, right? So, okay, the last one I think is very important, and this one was maybe the one that I could resonate with the most. It was distributing work fairly, and they found that underrepresented groups have higher rates of burnout, and a lot of systematic and environmental factors cause this. The people who happen to take on more repetitive work are likely to experience that burnout, and underrepresented groups are likely to take on that repetitive work. So these groups, basically anyone who's like not a man, are more likely to be burnt out and take on these tasks, and I think it's actually up to the majority to help to alleviate that pain and decrease that burnout. I know that I've experienced a lot of that myself. So that kind of reiterates that need for culture, collaboration, and communication, and examining what kind of work each person is doing. And that is all I have. DevOps is delicious. Thank you. Merci.